Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Scattergood, and I'll be the moderator this evening. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, but first we'll take care of some business. Please remain muted with the video off throughout the lecture. You can submit questions at any time during and after the lecture using the Zoom chat feature. The speaker will answer questions after the lecture as time allows. The contents of this presentation reflect the views of our speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, the Prairie Research Institute, the University of Illinois, or our sponsoring agencies. As I said earlier, my name is Sarah, and I'm the Archaeological Projects Coordinator at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. The survey, also referred to as ISAS, is a division of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. With about 70 full-time archaeologists and support staff working throughout the state, we are one of the largest archaeological research institutions in the US. Part of our mission is the dissemination of archaeological knowledge about the past to our peers, and especially to the public. In that spirit, we're offering a series of webinars this winter and next spring to highlight our research. Today, we're pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Andrew White. Andy recently joined ISAS as a research archaeologist at our central offices. He's been involved in Midwestern archaeology since the mid-90s, completing his bachelor's degree at Indiana University, his master's at Southern Illinois, and his PhD at the University of Michigan. Prior to joining ISAS, Andy spent 5 years working as a research assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. His background includes experience in cultural resource management, geophysics, lithic analysis, and computer modeling. Much of his research involves the hunter-gatherer societies of the Eastern Woodlands, with a particular emphasis on questions that involve demography, social change, and understanding how the behaviors and decisions of minimal social units, such as families and small groups, map up to the large-scale, long-term patterns that we can observe archaeologically. Andy also believes that the general public should have an accurate, evidence-based understanding of the human past, and advocates for engagement with popular pseudo-archaeological claims about such things as Atlantis, giant skeletons, and ancient aliens. But he will not be talking about any of those things today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew White.
All right, thank you for the introduction, and thank everybody for coming to my talk. I didn't realize till I put this camera up, I'm really missing a good opportunity to put some propaganda behind me on the wall, but since I just got here and just moved into my office, it shall remain blank for the moment. I'm gonna play the in progress card right away. So what I'm going to talk about today is very much kind of a thinking out loud presentation. The ideas and kind of the questions that I'm interested in here are ones that I have been chewing on for a long time, but I have only kind of nibbled at the edges and never tried to take a big bite. So today, or with this presentation, I'm going to start talking about what it kind of would take to get into it a little bit more. The questions about these possible demographic expansions that cover a lot of the Eastern Woodlands through this swath of the mid-continent have been around for a long time, and they're big, interesting questions that we simply cannot answer. If my child would ever ask me why there are Agate Basin points in New Jersey, I wouldn't be able to come up with a reasonable explanation. That's sad, so maybe by the time she graduates from college. When I was at Michigan, the apocryphal story that would go around was that the way Lou Binford would give a lecture, whoops, I want to be able to see my face, would give a lecture was that he would tell you what he was going to tell you, and then he would tell it to you, and then he would finish by telling you what he just told you. So I'm going to kind of follow that structure today. So all the spoilers up here at front. What I'm going to tell you is there are distributions of projectile points that are planes-related projectile points that extend from east of the Mississippi River at times all the way over to the Atlantic coast. we can say something about the timing and the scales of the expansions that would have resulted in that material evidence. But that's about all we can say at this point. If we ever want to get to the how and the why questions, these more interesting questions, there is a lot of work to be done. One, we have to really work on the kind of hard data component, getting a good handle on collecting enough data on the points that we can describe the archaeological patterns in a way that lets us interpret them with some confidence. We need a lot more information on the environment and the environmental changes that I think were key to these expansions. And we need a model-based framework for interpreting those patterns. Archaeological data do not speak for themselves. There has to be some theory building involved in there to ultimately come up with an explanation. The things I'm going to talk about today, some components of this I have quite a bit of confidence in, and some I have almost none. So if you ask me, did these demographic shifts really occur? I'm going to say, yeah, I think they did. I can't really think of any other explanation for the distribution that we see. If you ask me when they occurred and kind of what was the spatial scope, I can tell you something about those with a pretty good degree of confidence, because a lot of people have been kind of working at components of assembling these data set for a long time. So I'm pretty confident in that. If you ask me why, I can tell you a story, but I'm not sure it's the right story yet. So those more interesting questions, getting into the human behaviors and the reasons for things happening, are definitely in that uncertain territory at this point. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this problem is that it is a human movement problem. And if you look at the history of North American archaeology, there has been a bit of a pendulum in terms of our acceptance of movements or migrations or kind of horizontal demographic changes to explain cultural change. The processual archaeology of the 60s, 70s, and 80s is at one end, and the cultural historical archaeology that processual archaeology was reacting to is kind of at the other end. If you go back and you read articles from the 1930s and 1940s, every change in projectile point morphology is, a new people coming in and replacing a previous people. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's kind of the gist. If you look at processual archaeology, it's all about in situ change and development and explaining things through these processes that are often gradual, and there's a lot of stability involved. I think now we're kind of somewhere in the middle of those. It's nice that it is okay to talk about people moving around again as an explanation, even though we obviously don't want to swing into territory where that is the explanation for everything. Here's a cartoon version of this very complex history. I kind of feel like processual archaeology kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of looking at human movements as an explanation for change. They definitely aren't the only explanation for change, but they are a possible explanation for change. People move around all the time in all kinds of complicated ways and for all kinds of different reasons. There are really kind of two sets of assumptions you can go into a big problem like explaining this that you can have in your pocket. And one is this population stability continuity model. The population stayed the same in all the regions. You have to explain change region by region without a whole lot of movement. That would be, in my view, kind of more linked to a processual way of looking at things. In a lot of ways, this is kind of what I learned. And then there's a fluidity discontinuity model where you can accept that people move around, societies shift, things change, and you get all kinds of interesting situations that come up here. You can get populations moving from one area to another and coalescing or contracting into a certain region. That might leave a region abandoned and another population might move in, so you might have a replacement. And that could result in a technological discontinuity or something in the chronology that can be explained by that. Then you might have regions being completely abandoned for long periods of time. I kind of started thinking along these lines in the early 2000s, and this is an illustration from an article that I published in 2006 on the Paleoindian occupation of northeastern Indiana. Because I was confronted again with this kind of plethora of projectile point types all on the same landscape that didn't make any sense in a simple kind of unilineal sequence. One thing that I was particularly interested in was the transition from Holcomb, which are kind of this last end of the fluted point sequence up there, into Hilo, which is a Dalton cognate. And you can kind of wrestle with these and you can try to figure out how one could have turned into the other, but I wasn't satisfied with that and it didn't seem to make any sense. So the explanation that made a lot more sense to me with the data that I had was that there was that discontinuity is explained much easier by a population shift. There's a replacement going on. As one group moves out, another group moves in, and you can look at the lithic data and it tends to support that and yada, yada, yada. I confronted the problem of having plains projectile points in northern Indiana at the same time, but I kind of didn't really fully engage with it at that point. They were there. I didn't have enough information in front of me or a big enough scope to understand what they were doing there. They were just there and they kind of had to be dealt with. So I didn't really try to tackle them at that point. But they remain, and they're essentially still unexplained, which is why I think this is an interesting problem. These three maps here with illustrations of the points, and I'll talk a little bit more about what each of the points are, just in case you're not familiar with them. This is a GIS map with the projectile point boundaries from Noel Justice's 1987 book drawn on there, so you can see where he put these boundaries. Folsom creeps across the Mississippi River. Agate Basin goes all the way over to the East Coast, and you get Cody stuff, Scottsbluff and Eden in the upper Great Lakes, kind of wrapping around into Ontario. And that was 1987. One thing that's really important to this story is the environmental context, which we have learned a lot about in the last few decades. All of this stuff that happens with these, especially middle and late Paleoindian projectile point technologies and the possible movements of people that are associated with them, all occur in the context of really fairly rapid environmental change that was significant, and it had a lot of effects on ecology, how plants and animals and humans were related to one another, and so on. And so that has to be kind of factored in there also. I am not an environmental determinist, but I think that if you are trying to understand hunter-gatherers without taking a good look at significant environmental change, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because you have to be able to factor that in. This picture of the Younger Dryas just shows the planet was warming up at the end of its Milankovitch cycle to get out of that ice age, and that's my green dashed line that I superimposed on there. And then all of a sudden, boom, there's a big drop in temperature starting about 12,900 years ago. That lasts about 1,000 years or so. It has different effects in different parts of the world. In a lot of places, it makes it colder. It's a return to full glacial conditions. In other places, it actually makes it warmer. In some places, it's more arid. In other places, it's more wet. But it changed a lot of stuff, and it changed it pretty quickly. So hunter-gatherers would have had to somehow have adapted their behaviors to that. There would have been some kind of response. I won't get into what actually caused the Younger Dryas, whether it was, anyway. But humans would have had to respond to it. The climate change was real. That's an important part of the story. In terms of the backdrop here, I think most of us think of the East and the West as being significantly different. In the East, we have forests, and in the West, they have grasslands. And this is the map of the ecological regions of North America, data from the EPA. They show the Great Plains coming all the way up to the Mississippi River of Illinois, and then from there on, you're in the cool shade of the forest. If you go down to Missouri, you have some forest down there, into Arkansas, and so on. That's the way we conceive of it, and we conceive of it in such a strong fashion that we built a monument to it. The St. Louis Arch is the gateway to the West. You are going from east to west, from the forest over to the plains. But if you look at it in a different way, if you just look at the physical landscape, it cross-cuts those ecological regions. Here's the Great Plains superimposed on that map of physiography. And the Central Lowlands are kind of split. Some are in kind of this Great Plains region on that side of the Mississippi River, and the rest are on the east. The Central Lowlands is where most of us up here in lovely Illinois, and I saw some people from Indiana. This is where we are. It's the largest physiographic region in the country. It is relatively low relief. A lot of it is flat. It's glacial till plains. It's some rolling hills and so on. It's great for agriculture. It's the best farmland we have in the country, and I just threw that map on there of corn yields, so you can see how well it matches up with the Central Lowland. I had a student once in South Carolina get mad at me because I insulted the soils and said it wasn't good farmland. And I would like to show him pictures of the cornfields that we actually have here because it's quite a bit different. So there's a difference between physiography and ecology, and that's an important difference to understand in the context of this story. Physiography is the physical geography. It's the soils, landscape, relief, that sort of thing. It's the physical characteristics. Ecology are all the organisms on that physical landscape and how they relate to one another and how they relate to that landscape. So physiography can change a little bit, but ecology can change a lot more, I would say. It's a good way to think about it. When you're going through a period of significant environmental change, climate change, those ecological relationships and how they relate to the underlying physiography are not stable. And they were not stable during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. And neither were the human populations. And I think this is one of the key reasons why this is a time when we see people moving out of the Great Plains into areas of the East in a way that I don't think is repeated after that, definitely not at this scale. Okay, so just when we try to explain or think about any kind of archaeological problem, you know, we often want to know what happened, how did it happen, and why did it happen? These are never easy questions to answer archaeologically. We cannot actually observe what it is that we are trying to understand. We can't go back in the past, build a time machine and watch people doing something. We're left with these material residues and we have to piece it together from there and so on. These are especially tough questions when you're talking about phenomena that unfolded on, you know, half continental or continental scales over thousands of years of time. They become tricky both to answer logistically and because analogies and things like that fall short very, very quickly because there is no situation you can look at in the world today that really helps you understand the big picture. So these are kind of classically hard and classically good, I would argue, problems that archaeology can be used to solve that really no other social science can. So another spoiler alert, these are my working answers to what exactly happened here. I think the expansion of Folsom eastward was related to an uptick in the scales of residential mobility. This is complemented by a downtick in residential mobility in the east, which I'll talk a little bit about why I think that happened exactly, but those complement each other. I think as the expansion continues, as the Younger Dryas plays out, the expansion continues eastward, and that's marked by Agate Basin. So I think these are actually related. They're not two different pulses. They're one pulse that's continuing and changing. By the end of the Younger Dryas, Eastern Archaic societies, and actually beginning with Dalton, were expanding northward into the Central Lowland and filling up these areas as the forest expanded up there, and plains populations end up persisting in the northern Great Lakes above Lake Superior and into Ontario until the end of the early Archaic, ultimately, and then they are no longer there after that. That's kind of the demographic sketch, I think, of what happens. This is the weird thing about doing a Zoom presentation because I can't actually see anybody. Actually, I can see the top of one person's head. But when I put this slide up in front of my classes, the number of people who knew who this was year after year was declining. But I know that at least some of in the audience recognize this as MC Hammer time. And when it's MC Hammer time, it's time to break it down. So one of the things that I learned from my computational modeling background is that if you have a really, really hard problem, and this is a hard problem, you break it down into a bunch of smaller problems that are of the size that they can be dealt with, and you have to find the right sequence to deal with them. Everybody in my classes always knew who Harry Potter was, and when I would tell them that I didn't like Harry Potter, if they weren't paying attention, I would tell them I hated Harry Potter, and they would glare at me like they wanted to kill me. It was actually kind of scary. Anyway, let's break it down. So these are the three ways that I would look at this problem. First, there's a pattern. You have to recognize that there's a pattern there. We've done that. We can check that box. You have to be able to describe the pattern. We can describe a little bit about it. We can describe kind of the outlines, but we can't describe it in any kind of way that is really useful, I would say, quantitatively and for comparison, either with other archaeological data or with model data or whatever. Then we need to contextualize that pattern. We need to understand what the circumstances are that surround it. And then we can get on to interpreting it and explaining it. So let's start with the pattern recognition part. All right, a pattern is a bunch of elements that repeat in a predictable manner. These are examples of patterns. We can all recognize those right away. We can see them. We can describe those patterns. It's harder to describe the patterns than it is to simply recognize them. There are all kinds of different ways you could describe this by color, contrast, number of elements, how often they repeat, whatever. But those are things that have to be added to the fact that we just recognize it as a pattern. The pattern that we're seeing here is these projectile point forms from the west that occur far east of the Mississippi River. There are several different kinds. And people have recognized this pattern since at least the 1940s. Pretty soon after Folsom itself was identified, people recognized these things, say, in Wisconsin. There are Folsom points here and so on. As our understanding of projectile point variability and kind of the imposition of typology has changed and grown over the years, we've gotten a pretty good basic time-space understanding of the distributions of these things. Noel Justice's book from 1987 is a good example. He kind of lays it all out, and a lot of those distributions, which I'll go through, haven't really changed a whole heck of a lot since then. There have been multiple kind of state and region level efforts to catalog these points now that they're recognized. None of those kind of gets at the whole question, maybe with the exception of Folsom because it's small enough. When I see all this data out there, I think of this apple, which is a piece of low-hanging fruit, and that is the place where you start. So how I've decided to start attacking this problem is by consolidating those data, trying to connect them together and knit them into one single data set and figure out what needs to happen to complement them, to add to them in a way that helps us describe the pattern. A lot of people have contributed to this over the years. Just to go through some of them, Richard Fischel cataloged a bunch of Agate Basin points in Illinois and Indiana, Wisconsin, mostly. Pat Munson did his study in the 1990s of the distribution of Folsom in Wisconsin, Illinois, Northwest Indiana. Chris Ellis, Brian Deller, and Peter Stork in Ontario have published papers here and there on Scottsbluff, Cody materials that are up there. Other stuff, Dylan Carr did a dissertation and mostly focused in Wisconsin on late Paleoindian. John Lambert and Tom Label, who are here at ISAS, have worked on the Folsom record, among other things, in Illinois, Wisconsin. Jeb Bowen has been collecting projectile point data from private collections institutions for decades now in Ohio and has made that available. My dissertation work looked at a lot of collections all over this region: Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky. Brad Koldehoff has recently, 2013, published a monograph on archaic and Paleoindian points in parts of Illinois that also has some interesting data in it. I assembled all this stuff together, that low-hanging fruit from those published studies, and there's a lot more out there that I haven't gotten to yet. Grouped the points into 4 groups. Just to go through these real quick. Folsom points, pretty easy to recognize. They are thin, symmetrical, flat cross-section, bifacially fluted, really, really high degree of workmanship, ground half margins. Concave base, often with a remnant of the instrument-assisted fluting that was used to remove the flutes. Agate Basin points are long and well-made. They're a little bit thicker. They have this elliptical cross-section, not fluted. They have really long stems with heavily ground margins. They're sometimes parallelly flaked, and they're often longitudinally resharpened. And by that, I mean that they're resharpened from the tip down to the base. So you get shorter and shorter stubs till basically you have just a haft with like a little triangular blade at the end before they're discarded. Scottsbluff material is stemmed. Cody complex includes points called Scottsbluff and Eden. Oftentimes they're parallel flaked, not always. The haft margins are ground. They have elliptical cross sections and these kind of weak to non-existent shoulders. These points form a time sequence. So Folsom comes first, Agate Basin is next, and then Scottsbluff, and they overlap in time also from one to the other. So there's not even necessarily a clean breaks in these kind of, these are, discrete types imposed on a continuum of variation, let's say. Here again is Noel Justice's map showing the distribution of Folsom. It goes over into southern Wisconsin and western Illinois. It goes over Lake Michigan. Since then, there's the PIDBA map on the left there. Sorry, it doesn't have the boundary of Illinois on it, but the red dots are Folsom points. So you can see it goes over Lake Michigan and over to northwest Indiana a little bit. There's Pat Munson's map from the 1990s. Shows Folsom all over. northern and central Illinois and over into northwest Indiana. And there's Tom Label's and colleagues map from 2016, so pretty much the same distribution. Here's the data set that I assembled, and no surprises there. These are all the Folsom points that I kind of got in my first scoop, 233 of them, same distribution. All right, as far as Agate Basin, and again, I apologize that the ice lobes are on there, but there couldn't really be Agate Basin points there anyway if there were ice, but those don't necessarily correspond to the Agate Basin period. One's earlier, one's later. Anyway, the distribution goes all the way across, includes all of Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, goes over into New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and that's from Justice, 1987. Some more fine-grained distribution maps. There's Richard Fischel's map from 1988, and there's the data that Jeb Bowen has made available of a lot of Agate Basin points in Ohio. And I know that there's Agate Basin related publications from Pennsylvania and in areas east of that, and stuff that's possibly related to it up in Quebec, but I haven't gotten into the weeds on those yet. Here is the data set that I've assembled, 785 of these. You can see they're thicker or they're more documented in the western part of the distribution, but there's quite a few. Whether that is really that kind of gap in southern Illinois and southern Indiana, or the light density is really reflecting an absence or not, it's kind of an open question, as well as Michigan. I looked at a lot of collections from there, and if there were a lot of them, I think I probably would have seen more. But anyway, that's what we have. It stops at the Appalachian Mountains, but potentially kind of curves around up there to the north. Cody complex. These are the distributions of Scottsbluff and Eden from Justice. And they're pretty much gone from a lot of the mid-continent, but they're up in Wisconsin and the UP and Ontario still. And here's the data set that I assembled. And I know there's more of this stuff out there too. The big orange dot in the UP is the Gordo site, very famous one. And there's a scattering of material that goes around Lake Ontario over there that's been documented. Okay, so continuing the breakdown, let's go to the context. All right, so context I think of as the circumstances that form the setting. So we can think about this in a number of different ways. All archaeological events have environmental context. You know, things happen in the real world. Technological context, where are these societies? How do they do stuff? What do their tools look like? How are those kind of utilized to remove energy from the world? And social contexts, what are they like? Developing all of these issues helps identify and frame, developing the context helps identify and frame all of these issues that are kind of this thing that has to happen to get to the explanation part. Now, I know that hunter-gatherers do more than hunt and gather, but I really feel like you have to understand ecology to make any sense out of the rest of the stuff. That has to be factored in, especially when you're talking about a period of environmental change that is as kind of distinct and widespread and significant as the Younger Dryas, which is when these things are taking place, the end of the Ice Age, and this weird reversal that happens, and then into the Holocene. If you don't factor in environment in that, I think that you really have a problem on this large time scale, a lot of stuff going on. So you have to account for that. So the changing ecological contexts are important. The effects of the Younger Dryas, this climatic reversal, were complex. It didn't necessarily get cold and become glacial again everywhere. In the mid-continent, though, that was kind of the prevailing trend. It became cooler and drier. In the southeast, it actually became a little bit warmer. One of the big things that happened during the Younger Dryas is it was hard on large animals. Over 70% of the species that were about 100 pounds or more go extinct and are no longer around. Here's just a couple charts from different publications showing these Pleistocene extinctions. Some of them were already underway. You know, maybe the Younger Dryas was the last nail in the coffin for some of these critters. Some of them went extinct before the Younger Dryas. Maybe human hunting had to do with some of them and not others. But some species persist and some don't. So gone are the mammoths and the mastodons and the horses and the ground sloths and things like that. And humans do just fine in the Younger Dryas. Human societies persist and grow, and so did some other animals. And one of them is bison. Bison actually thrive during Younger Dryas. And this may or may not be an important part of the story. It's an area that I think needs further investigation. If you look at environmental records, the aridity of the Younger Dryas increased the density or the abundance of C4 grass, which is the main kind of dietary component of bison. There's physiological reasons for that, which I won't get into. The amount of grassland went up, and maybe that was why bison began to flourish and were able to increase their range and their abundance. And also a lot of their competitors were gone. This quote is from a paper that was written about the Big Eddy site, which is in Missouri. So not necessarily in the mid-continent, but kind of on the borderland there. If you look at archaeological interpretations of Folsom in the West, the link between Folsom and bison is super, super strong. They are thought of as a very specialized kind of bison-centric society. I don't want to be too critical of the Western record because I'm not there and I haven't read into it deeply enough, but the emphasis is strong. Let's just leave it at that. When you say Folsom, you think bison, and part of it might be because of the way the archaeological record works, and part of it are because of other lines of evidence that they have developed. And that was part of Pat Munson's argument for why Folsom comes across into Illinois and Indiana, that there was an expansion of prairie habitat in the late Pleistocene, early Holocene there, and bison went along with it. More recently, Tom Label and his colleagues have stated that the establishment of the Illinois prairie is too late for that to happen, and the earliest dated bison remains we have are too late, that Folsom was here before any positive evidence for bison. So that becomes an issue in explaining what Folsom is actually doing on this side of the river. I think you have to ask though, and again, this is a part where I haven't gotten far enough down in the weeds to be able to answer it myself, is the absence of evidence for bison really evidence that they are absent? Like if you look at Meltzer and Holliday's map of where the pollen cores are that they're using to talk about the Younger Dryas, you know, there aren't any in the Midwest. And if you look at Macmillan's study about the bison, they were here in the late Pleistocene and they were here later in the Holocene. And I'm not sure at this point how we established that they weren't here at some other time other than by some proxy measures. So maybe those are kind of things that need to be developed further to answer this question. So that's yet another thing for the to-do list. I apologize for using a picture of the Dallas Cowboys. I wanted to punt. I find a picture of somebody punting, and this was the best one that came up. So there you go. If bison is not part of the answer east of the Mississippi River for Folsom, that brings up another really good question. If they are so laser focused on bison in the West, then why do they just go after a different game animal on this side of the river? Like, how can that be? There would have to be a significant difference in the way those societies were organized, I would guess. So that is something to consider also. So either way, the answer I think is going to be an interesting one. Let's move it on. We're going to continue breaking it down at the interpretation and explanation part. So we've got this pattern. We can describe some aspects of it. We understand a little bit about the environmental context. So how do we make inferences from those facts? Those facts put in context. How do we answer some why questions? How do we come up with a scenario of demographic changes that fits with all that evidence that we can be comfortable with or that we can test in the future? Here's a basic chronological framework showing East and West together. If you stick the Younger Dryas in there, you'll notice that in the East, it's a time of regionalization. We've got kind of this basement Clovis culture, the post-Clovis technologies that come out of that, Gainey, Redstone, these things start to split into North and South. Not only do they split technologically to where they look different, but they also seem to be split physically. There's empty space where they are not joined up together. So the populations seem to be regionalizing by a couple different independent lines of evidence there. When I tell a story, I like to start at the beginning of the story, and even millennials know this movie. So the beginning is a very good place to start. And one reason I like to think this way is because even though I kind of gave processual archaeology a little bit of lip service at the beginning, I am still very much a believer that understanding process is really, really important. And process is a recipe There are inputs, there are things that happen, and then there are outputs. And you will never understand a process unless you understand those three components. So say the inputs here are the societies, their kind of behavior rules, their technology, that sort of thing, the environment. There's some kind of change. The operations that occur are those mechanics and dynamics, and then something else emerges that's different at the end. The inputs matter. If your recipe for carrot cake calls for oil and you put in Pennzoil instead of vegetable oil, you're going to get a different output. So we need to know what's happening at the beginning of the story in order to tell the story. We are never going to understand the Agate Basin part of the question unless you understand the Folsom part, because that precedes it and almost certainly affects it. So starting at the beginning, the distribution of these post-Clovis points, Barnes and Cumberland, retract. We have a situation where there's early Paleoindian stuff all over Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois. You get into the Younger Dryas in the Middle Paleoindian period, and there are large parts of the landscape that look like they might have actually been abandoned. There aren't the known technologies of that time period, the indigenous technologies are not there. You get things like Quad, Beaver Lake, and Cumberland. Those are largely south of the Ohio River. You get early Dalton stuff, which is potentially coming straight out of Clovis, which is over in southern Missouri in the hill country. And then you get the other contraction up in the Great Lakes. Barnes, Park Hill, which eventually turns into Holcomb, is up there. So you get this big swath of the till plain where there doesn't seem to be anybody there, perhaps for a little while. And that's where the Folsom populations come in and expand to that, what I think was a vacant area. And if you superimpose these other kind of indigenous projectile point distributions on the Folsom map, you can see there's plenty of room where the Folsom people are, where those points are. There's probably nobody there. The evidence for this, there's, if you can discriminate late Dalton from early Dalton, it looks like there is a gap between Clovis and late Dalton in central and northern Illinois. There's not an indigenous technology that fits in there, so there's room for something to come in from the outside. And actually, we're missing a lot of that, a lot of indications of occupation across the till plain. This is the PIDBA map here, which shows you the distribution of Cumberland points all the way down there in Tennessee. That's where it's really heavy. It does go up to the Ohio River, but there's really not a whole lot of stuff there. And you have to get up into Ontario and Michigan to really get a lot of, fluted point technology that's post-Gainey, your Barnes, Park Hill, and eventually unfluted Holcomb. Not much across central Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. This is an illustration from my dissertation that fleshes out this contraction by looking at stone tool raw material transport. In the early Paleoindian period, they are moving stone tools large distances, probably by mobility is the primary component. And the raw material sources, they knit together into a pattern that suggests that the whole landscape was being used. If you fast forward to the late Paleoindian, and I believe the center map is my Dalton and Hilo, they're not moving as far of distances, and there are large swaths that appear to be unoccupied or unutilized. When you have a contraction of range, which is suggested by those differences in stone tool transport, you either have to abandon part of the landscape or you have to increase your population to fill it in if you're going to maintain a society and all of those social links that are necessary for keeping that fabric woven together. If you cut mobility in half, you actually have to increase your population by 4 times to kind of fill that same space. So I think that as mobility decreases in response to changes of the Younger Dryas, and the megafauna are gone, people are concentrating on the same animals that we have today, deer, things like that. Mobility decreases and those populations have to contract, and they contract into the 2 most productive environments in this area. They go up to the Great Lakes and they go down to the Ohio Valley, and they get out of that till plain, which might have been, some kind of boreal forest or some kind of prairie woodland or something without a modern analog. So they abandon that area. If that's the explanation for population contraction, is a change in mobility also the explanation for a population expansion? If you go into the archaeology of the West and you look at Clovis and Folsom, I have yet to find a good data set that gives me quantitative data in terms of kilometers of transport and all that sort of stuff. But you can see this general idea that Clovis is generalized foraging societies and Folsom are specialized hunters, and they have higher residential mobility and larger home range. So that kind of computes. If you have the same amount of people and mobility expands because the game situation expands and so on, then the population expands in space kind of like a balloon. It could be the same amount of people, but they have to expand somehow. Going into the Agate Basin part of the scenario, Holcomb in the Great Lakes appears to move out. Those are last included point hunters. They head up to the northeast. A lot of the stuff in the southeast is still south of the Ohio Valley. There's not really any evidence for quote unquote indigenous technologies in that region. So I think that expansion continues, and that's when Agate Basin makes its way all the way across the Central Lowland, and apparently makes it to the sea. Maybe they actually put their toes in the water. Who knows? And they also colonized the UP as the ice was receding from there. Probably the very first people in the Upper Peninsula. And here's my map showing the Dalton Heartland, the Quad Dalton area, and Holcomb, which would have been moving out there. And so this is kind of a palimpsest of these things kind of put together, not showing exactly a really thin slice of time, but a thicker slice of time. The evidence for this, again, is that technological gap in central Illinois. Little to no evidence of intensive occupation across large swaths of the lowland. We do have one stratigraphic occurrence. Granted, it's in Oklahoma, but it has Agate Basin-like points underneath Dalton, suggesting that it predates that. And if you look at the entire radiocarbon record, mostly Agate Basin seems to be earlier than what is called late Dalton. And Agate Basin folks are making a lot of use of that Upper Mercer chert source in Ohio, while contemporary Eastern point makers, as far as I know, do not. So what drove that further expansion? If the first one was based on mobility, are we still seeing that? Are Agate Basin people yet again even more mobile, or is there a population increase, or both? Don't know at this point. We don't have anywhere near the amount of data, I think, to kind of develop that argument. The final thing that happens is with Cody. As the Younger Dryas comes to an end, the Central Lowland starts to fill up with forest. You get Dalton people coming up the Mississippi Valley and somehow getting a cognate form over into Michigan, which is high-low. And eventually that whole landscape gets filled in by early archaic people like Kirk and Thebes, and that stuff is everywhere. It is thick. They are definitely using the whole entire landscape. And the Cody, or the plains-related folks, are all the way up in the Great Lakes at that point, the very northern Great Lakes, and they stay up there for quite a while. There's my map of Kirk. There are so many Kirk points. Somebody used to joke that it's almost like they rain down from the sky, but they're everywhere. There's no doubt what was going on there. And the terminus between these two basically corresponds to the northern edge of the deciduous forest. And there's evidence for contemporaneity. They have some non-isomorphic point distributions. This has been pointed out in Ontario and Wisconsin, and there is a pattern of notched archaic points being found on sites that have a lot of Cody material. And this has been interpreted in both Wisconsin and Michigan as evidence that these cultures or societies may have even been bumping up against each other, may have been interacting in some way. So that's pretty cool. All right, so there are two possible scenarios here. Either all of this Western stuff is coming in multiple waves. The Folsom people come over and then they go back, and the Agate Basin people come over and then they go back, and then the Cody people come over and then they go back. So that's one possibility. Or there's a continuity of it. It's Folsom and it's pushing in and it's changing and it's getting pushed north. If you had to ask me right now, I would pick the bottom one as the kind of more elegant explanation for what we see. So quick demographic sketch. Folsom expands eastward. That expansion continues. Eastern archaic societies expand northward in the Central Lowland as the environment is changing, and that's where the plains people go up there, and that adaptation persists up there, perhaps associated with boreal forest until the end of the early Archaic. So basically we have one environmental period and we have two different responses in this large area of the Central Lowland. That's a really interesting thing to try to explain and flesh out. And ultimately it's interesting because a mobility related explanation gives us an entry point to look at a lot of really other interesting dominoes that might be connected in these societies. Mobility gives us an entry point because we can recognize and talk about it archaeologically, but it's linked to so many other aspects of hunter-gatherers' lives and social structures. And ultimately, it's a human level behavior that is structured by social networks. families and small groups make decisions about where to move and when to move. There's no kind of overarching controlling authority. So you can kind of really have to get down to the nitty gritty. And changes in mobility, big changes that would cause expansion and contraction on that scale would have all kinds of ripple effects in terms of the way these societies are structured and organized and working, how they maintain and create social relationships over long distances, and so on. So hang in there, we're almost there. I thought about doing this whole presentation with the I'm a cat thing, but I'm not technologically savvy enough to actually pull that off. I was afraid that I would actually be stuck like that. So anyway, we're almost done. So what I told you was that projectile point distribution suggests that this demographic expansion occurred. We can say something about the timing and scales of that, but little else. We can develop ideas about the how and the why questions, but there's a lot of other things that kind of need to be developed more to answer those. Sufficient data to describe the archaeological patterns, getting a better handle on the environment, and constructing that model-based framework. So how do we move the needle on this stuff? The good scientist in me says we develop multiple lines of evidence, we construct and test multiple hypotheses, and we use model-based analysis to understand cause and effect and address equifinality problems. In terms of the components to be addressed, the basic data are a big one. We need to continue to weave everything together that we have to get an understanding of real scale. We need to look outside the area and make sure that we're getting the edges. We need to collect more detailed data, not just occurrences, but morphology of these things, so we can understand the structural variability in the point types. How are they related to points in the West? How can we discriminate Agate Basin from other stemmed points that people might be reporting as Agate Basin, which are later archaic in age? There's a lot of work to be done there. And after we do that, we can understand how that variability patterns with regard to space. What kind of spatial patterning can we see? That'll give us something to interpret with a model-based analysis. So time and space issues are important. Right now, we are at the mercy of Western chronology. They don't have that many dated sites out there, but they have way more than we do, which is, as far as I know, mostly zero. There are typological issues to address too. We need to get a much better handle on the environment, and ultimately need to understand how human decisions map up to archaeological patterns. And that's kind of the more theory building part of it. This part requires a ton of collaboration. It already has been collaborative in the sense that so many researchers have contributed to being able to even put together a picture over the years. But it would be awesome to get everybody together and try to get everything on in the same kind of frame of reference and really knit this stuff together and have one big data set. As you develop these things, you build ideas, test them, rinse, repeat, do it over and over again, get in that inductive deductive cycle and try to come up with a plausible interpretation that's consistent with all available evidence, and then try to find more evidence to see whether it's consistent with that. I think a satisfying explanation for this would have to account for the environmental stuff, would have to account for the technological changes, would have to understand or be able to address the social context that were going on, those ecological relationships, the behavior at levels where humans actually make decisions, families and small groups, that were part of this, that maybe never saw the big picture or understood what was going on. That's kind of the level that I would like to get to eventually, and that's a model-based level, which has not been collaborative for me. This has been very lonely, where I sit in front of my computer, I get a lot of headaches, I spend a year spinning my wheels, and so on and so forth. But I think that aspect of it is what's going to get us past that kind of pattern description and into something that would qualify as explanation, finally. So that's what I want to talk about today. Thank you for listening to my talk. This kind of research is not possible without the contributions of many people, whether they realize they're contributing or not. Over the course of decades, it has taken to assemble these data. So it's great to think about being able to use them, data that's in the hands of private people, that's in institutions, that's looked at by scholars, avocationals, other stakeholders. I've had conversations with some people about this, got some people scratching their heads, so that's been very pleasant. I freely admit that my ideas about this are half-baked at this point, but things all start out as half-baked. Nothing starts off as fully baked. And of course, my position at ISAS is responsible for giving me the time to actually put this together for the first time ever. And because I attempt to be a good scholar, there are the references for the citations that I had in there. Maybe I'll leave that up during the questions just in case anybody is actually interested. So that is what I had to say, and I'm sure that you are all applauding in your own living rooms, but it's so weird being on Zoom that I'm just gonna have to use my imagination. So what happens now?
So now, well, first off, thank you. That was great. We have a few minutes for questions, and we've already had a couple trickling in. So we'll just get it rolling. The first one is from Richard. He asked, how do you discriminate mobility versus trade and adoption?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, and that's something I'm actually working on some modeling to do that right now. Nobody has a good answer to that yet. Like, we know that stone tools moved, and we know that sometimes they moved really, really long distances. We know that hunter-gatherers both tend to move, and they also exchange things all the time. They all do it. So there are multiple mechanisms for that. So, you know, one thing that people often do is if we have whole assemblages moving of points and scrapers and, you know, flakes and other things, you can make a pretty good argument that that's probably people taking toolkits and discarding and using them and so on. And if you have a single artifact that's moving way, way beyond, you know, 2 standard deviations from the mean, then maybe that was moving through some other mechanism. But I mean, that's an excellent question because, you know, that's related to the whole idea of how much water we ask lithic artifacts to carry in terms of our explanations and interpretations. And I think it's something that people are still kind of grinding out and working on. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
Thank you. Our second is from Michelle. She asked, how would increase in population or decrease in available game contribute to increase in competition and necessitate larger home ranges?
Well, so that's I mean, I guess what I hear in that question is, you know, as populations contract into areas, like I think they're contracting because they're being pulled in there. They are, in order to keep their societies knit together, like with a smaller mobility component, they have to occupy a smaller space. I don't think they're being pushed in there by the landscape filling up. And in fact, it's that leaves this gap that I think makes it possible. You know, there's a vacuum that can be filled. So I guess I don't know how much they would be competing in that circumstance because they're actually kind of, you know, huddling together to increase security. But like I said, there are ripple effects to that, and that might be some of what we see in Dalton, where you see other mechanisms of you know, interaction between groups and marking territories and things like that that come up or emerge as the dynamics change between neighboring groups. You know, we see that play out over the long term during the Archaic. Like once the landscape actually does really fill up and the population is growing at whatever rate, you know, you see these societies having to intensify and they're in smaller and smaller territories and mobility becomes constrained because there are people out there. You can't just go and necessarily move. And so you get a whole different set of dynamics. I don't know whether we see that in the Paleoindian period or not. I feel like you can see aspects of it somewhere, but that's another thing that I feel like has kind of not been maybe thought through as fully as it could be thought through at this point. Good question.
Thank you. Yeah, we have another one from Christopher. He says, you mentioned in passing that you believe Folsom was fluted by something other than direct percussion. Do you propose they were using a jig or something simpler like direct percussion?
No, so I am not a Folsom technology expert, but my understanding is that they were using some kind of indirect instrument-assisted fluting in the same way that Barnes and Cumberland and other things, where you have these more deeply concave points. It's hard to imagine being able to flute them with a baton or something. There's some other piece that goes in there, and whether that was a very simple thing or whether it's some other contraption, I don't know. I have moderate to low flint knapping skills. I couldn't make a Folsom point to save my life, so I don't have any kind of direct experience. So I will defer to Folsom experts on that one. But my understanding is the consensus is that, yeah, there was some kind of instrument assisted or indirect mechanics going on there to flute those things. And it was probably pretty risky because the fluting is really amazing.
looks like we have time for one more. Last one's from Paul. He asks, is there data for layover of ice sheets with human identified artifacts?
There's a good GIS layer, and that's the one that popped up on those maps because I forgot to remove it, that has the location of the ice sheets at a bunch of increments. That's it's a paper by Dalton et al. And there are GIS layers that go with that, and that's what I was using. It's a fairly recent paper in the last 2 years, I believe. Whether there's also another thing that has all the sites on it or not, I know I've seen papers that look at both of those and try to understand the timing of the retreat and readvances of ice sheets based on dated sites. So that probably does exist, but I don't know what that one would be off the top of my head. Sorry.
All right, well, thank you, Andy, for the presentation. It's really well done. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Our next virtual lecture will be on March 26th. If you want to watch any of our previous talks in this series, you can visit our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.